Welcome to Scaling Up Not Giving Up, the podcast for founders and leaders building businesses without selling their soul or giving away the reins. Today's guest is Aaron Trahan, a leadership performance coach who started by leading a $100 million business in his 20s, thrown in with no safety net. We get into the gap between ambition and execution, why feedback loops matter more than big ideas, how to build a culture that scales without burning people out, and the systems Aaron uses to keep businesses from outgrowing themselves. No fluff, just honest insight from someone who's been there. Let's get into it. So today, joined by Aaron. Aaron, firstly, just for the listeners, can you just give me a bit of background? Tell me about yourself.
Yes, absolutely, Richard. First and foremost, thanks for having me. Looking forward to a great conversation. And yeah, I kind of like to say leadership and the opportunity to lead came much earlier than I would have ever anticipated in my career. In my early 20s, I was put in to help lead a $100 million annual revenue business. So I got to experience what it was like to lead, to scale, to make all the mistakes. I'm quite confident I made every possible leadership and business growth mistake that you can make. And so over a period of time, I left the corporate world where I started, joined a few startups, and really just loved building from the ground up, really understanding a vision, putting an organizational structure and go-to-market roadmap in place, and then breaking things down to its smallest digestible prioritization chunks to make progress. That eventually led me to launching and founding my own business performance coaching and strategic advising firm about 3 years ago. And so my mission is now to really help organizations avoid the same mistakes that I see every business make when they're trying to make that leap from good to great with a system-driven approach. I now help implement the very exact systems that I wish I would have had that would have saved me from a lot of heartburn, heartache, and scars acquired along the way. So at a high level, that's kind of the origin story that's taking me here to this conversation with you today.
So such an interesting story, and I have so many questions already. So I'm going to dive straight in with the first one. Firstly, how did you end up being appointed a leader of an organization, of such a large organization, so young? And what was that like? Did you feel like you were drowning?
Yeah, yes. Easy answer is absolutely. I felt like I was drowning, but it's amazing what we can do when there's clarity around what's most important. And in this particular organization, the attributes or characteristics that they prioritize more than anything else was execution. And so it was a very flat organization. And if you were able to come in and push the boundaries, what's required to make progress and execute and just flat out get things done, you will get noticed. You would get rewarded, and there would be a whole different level of value that the organization would place on you. And so I happen to be in that environment where I learned that very early on that, look, ideas and strategy, that's easy, right? Execution is where the magic happens. And if you became one of those individuals inside this organization that was able to get things done, it gave you opportunities. And so for me, that was very clear up front. I knew that if I was going to grow, I had to be a very skillful operator that was able to execute. And so that's what got me noticed. That's what kind of got me on the map. And that was something that I hung on to. And I still use those lessons from back then to today of, look, all the ideas are great, but if we can't take vision and turn it into actual real results, the ideas, the goals, the mission, the visions, all of that's just wallpaper.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I see that a lot sometimes. I either see businesses don't invest in their values, the mission, the vision at or all they do is talk about the vision, the mission, where they're going to be in 10 years' time. And I'm like, that's great, but that doesn't mean you'll get there. You've got to actually have a plan, and you've got to kind of get your head down a little bit sometimes and just, right? I guess in that first leadership role for you then, I imagine you were quite reactive. How did you find that? And would you agree? Were you quite reactive? Did you feel like you were firefighting a lot, or did you feel relatively comfortable in the role?
Yeah, I would say It was a level of comfort with being uncomfortable. And I think that's the best way to put it. I don't think, when you're in a leadership role of a dynamic, fast growing organization, it should actually scare the hell out of you if you get too comfortable. You should never be comfortable and always be pushing yourself and the organization to constantly answer and address the question, what more are we capable of? And so as I kind of look back at that early journey leading an organization, I was much more comfortable around the operations and the strategy piece. The big learning curve for me was around the people piece. Look, we don't come out of college knowing how to lead people and lead teams and lead organizations. And so early on in those days, I made a lot of mistakes around leading people, around making sure that priorities were clear, making sure that we could be focused on the right things, add the context behind why are these priorities the most important priorities right now. And so as I continue to scale myself and the organization, that was an area that I had to keep working increasingly harder at to get better at in just learning and taking the lessons as they came and really force myself to be a good student that was able to learn, not thinking that I had everything figured out because I did experience early success. And so that was a challenging kind of constant calibration that I was having to go through.
How did you manage that to upskill yourself at the same time as scaling? Because it's hard to, scaling in itself can be difficult. Never mind scaling and learning at the same time and upskilling the people around you that'll also have their roles change as you're scaling. So how did you find that process? And how important do you think it is?
Yeah, I'll tackle the back half of that question first. I think it's wildly important. I would argue there's probably nothing more important. And I know that may come as a bit of a surprise to your audience. The reality was I was receiving a lot of feedback in the form of getting a lot of things wrong. And I had to learn the hard way through experience that you will never be able to scale a team, a business, or an organization over the long term faster than you scale yourself. And so there were numerous moments where I felt like the team, the business, the growth of the organization was outscaling me and I had to catch up. And so it really came down to understanding pain. And so I think it's just being aware of the different growing pains and the challenges and the chaos that growth will induce, and say, I've got to do things different if I want to change the environment and the outcomes that I'm seeing. And so scaling myself, I realized, became a key input that ultimately gave me the outcomes that I was looking for. But I'll be honest, that that came from a lot of that came on the back end of a lot of mistakes and some learning lessons that is just inevitable as you're building experience. I think that's where that pain element comes in, is because even in a fast growing business, that feeling that I know so many of your listeners has also experienced of just the growth almost feels out of control. I can't keep my arms around it. Yes, revenue is growing, but I feel like the chaos in the business is growing at an exponentially faster rate. Sometimes
What
we have
I
to
always
step.
say to people is they go, "Oh, it's a really nice problem to have." And I'm like, yes, but it's still a problem. And I think people, when from the outside, they don't get that. They just go, well, you're scaling, you're growing. This is fantastic. And it's a really nice problem to have. And I'm like, but a really nice problem is still a problem. Don't, I still have a problem.
Yeah, 100%. And look, for so many organizations, today's growth can be tomorrow's failure, if you're not careful, if you can't effectively manage it. Uh, And I, again, right place, right time, happened to be in an ultra competitive business. And I saw a lot of competitors that grew too fast, too quickly, wasn't able to manage it, and ultimately collapsed under the weight of their own unsustainable growth. And I think a big misconception. It's almost counterintuitive for a lot of people to understand. And that's, when you look at once high growth businesses that fail, it usually wasn't a top line issue. It usually wasn't a momentum issue. It really came down to not having the structure and the systems in place to effectively manage growth. And so today's growth became tomorrow's failure. So I was able to see that pretty clearly, experience that within the company that we were in. And so it was just a great reminder to make sure I needed to scale myself and my ability to lead at a faster rate than the organization was growing. And so for me, one of the big trigger points and a key learning lesson that I still use today is making sure you have the right quality of feedback loops coming in. Don't let success or current momentum blind you to the areas that need to improve. And something happens to leaders when they experience a certain level of success. This magical switch goes off inside all of our minds, and we start listening only to the things that we want to hear and stop listening to the things that we most need to hear that would point us in the direction of how we can get even better, how we can improve, how we can optimize, how we can enhance and scale ourselves. And so, as I look back, I was fortunate to have those feedback loops because there's just never going to be a substitute of getting the right feedback that helps you understand where those development areas are. And so one of the challenging questions that I think your audience can take away is to walk away saying, do I have the right feedback loops? Am I getting enough of the right inflow of information that helps me understand where I can get better? Because those areas of development or weaknesses even that you're not aware of have a 0% probability of being improved. So it starts with awareness. And if you're not aware and don't have the right feedback mechanisms in place to become aware of those things you need to develop and improve, my guarantee is that you will not see any development and improvement in those areas.
How do you make sure you've got the right feedback loop? Like, how do you know what is the right feedback loop or what isn't the right feedback loop, or if your feedback loop needs improvement? Just how do you know? Because I guess you could be burnt out, exhausted, overwhelmed, all of those things plus more potentially. So how, it's great us saying, a good feedback loop, but how do you know when you've got one? How do you know when you need a better one, and how do you get it?
Yeah. Yeah, I think first and foremost is kind of making sure you're getting feedback from the voices that really matter. Ideally, someone that you may work closely with, someone that can give you perspective outside of your own. And that can be someone above your level and or below that level. This could be peers in your industry, whatever it may be. And it doesn't have to be overcomplicated. What I help my clients do is simply ask and ask a lot. How many times are you asking in a given week, hey, what are your thoughts on how I could get even better? What are the areas you think that could help me take my leadership, my performance, my scale to an entirely different level? And so the word of caution I would say is do not sit back and wait for the feedback to come to you. That is exactly the signs of growth. What you don't want is an echo chamber. You don't want to ask those questions to someone who has nothing but positive and great things to say. I like to use Marshall Goldsmith, who's one of the top executive coaches for the past several decades. He has an interesting concept on making it easier to get the right type of feedback. We've always called it feedback, and it's usually historically looking. What could I have improved on in that presentation or over the past month or in that particular scenario? And it's more challenging for people to tell you that you've done something dumb or made a mistake. Instead, Marshall Goldsmith has a great concept called feed forward. And it makes it easier for people to help guide somewhat constructive feedback that can drive improvement. And instead of asking for feedback per se, ask for advice. The advice would be, hey, what do you think I could do differently moving forward that would help elevate my performance. That would make me a better leader. That would make me more effective. That would make me more impactful. Now they're not having to point to a scenario where you may have slipped up and they don't want to say something negative or worry about hurting your feelings. Make it future forward. What can I do more of? What can I do differently? What can I stop doing in the future that would make me better? So it's a way to kind of think about positioning what can you do differently moving forward to become a better leader, generate better performance, whatever it may be. It just changes the framing and the perspective.
What about if you've got a lot of feedback, but you don't know which to act on first? You're just a bit overwhelmed with lots of information, I guess, and you can't change everything at once. It's just not possible. So how do you prioritize that, and how do you zone in on what is the most important thing and what's going to make the biggest difference first, faster?
Yeah, I think that brings up a big challenge that every business and every leader in every business has, and it comes down to prioritization management, right? And so I would simply look, and let's say you have 10 pieces of feedback. If we're just using easy numbers here, it may be worth creating just a T graph, right? Draw a line right in the middle of the paper, a horizontal line up top. And if one side represents the feedback items, think about what's the best possible outcome that could be generated if you act on that feedback. So now it takes the feedback from just inputs and now shifts the perspective towards outcomes. And once you see what the outcomes could be generated from taking action on each piece of feedback, that prioritization, rating, and ranking all of a sudden gets a hell of a lot clearer for you, because now you can measure the impact of those outcomes in whichever one that you feel would be most needle moving, most performance enhancing, most good to great leaping, whatever it may be. But it's always best, in my opinion, to understand the so what, right? And so I got this feedback. So what? If I were to act on it, what exactly would that generate? What changes would that make? What outcomes would it generate differently from the outcomes that I'm getting today? And it's the outcomes that you really want to rate and prioritize based on what's going to be most meaningful to you and the job that you're able to do inside the business.
So I guess this is feedback for us as leaders. Would you suggest that the same feedback loops are used for the organization to improve from its customers, its clients? And would you recommend that other members of the team use similar feedback loops around them as well?
100%. I don't think feedback should be reserved across any one of those stakeholders. I don't know who to credit this quote to, but it's proven out, at least for me and the businesses that I've run and now the businesses that I work with, is almost 90% of the problems a business is facing can be solved simply by talking and gaining feedback from your customers. And I think the same can be true inside the lower levels of the organization with your end consumer, and simply ask. What I kind of like to think about this is a start, stop, keep mechanism. Hearing from them, what do you see that's working really well that we should keep? What are the things that you feel are driving our performance that we should not touch and we should keep doing? Then go to start. What are we not doing that we should start doing that could make a needle moving impact to the business? And then most importantly, because as you get higher up the ladder, you stop seeing the things that you're doing that quite frankly you shouldn't be doing. So I would ask, what are we currently doing that's not helping, that's slowing us down, that's making our lives more difficult, that doesn't matter to our customer, that we should stop doing? And so I think there's no shortage of ways to collect feedback for our own performance, for how to gain insights from different levels of the organization to accelerate progress within the organization, and then directly from our customers. What are we doing that you really love? I think if you do that consistently, you're getting high quality feedback loops that's at least giving you the opportunity to gain the insights to then drive the actions that then unlock better performance. But if you don't do that, the probability of getting to that end state of generating better performance all of a sudden becomes a low probability gamble if you're not getting the right streams of feedback and information coming back in on how you and the organization can improve.
Absolutely agree with you. I sit on quite a few boards in public and charity organisations, and the first thing I like to do when I join a board is go and speak to staff members and shadow them for a day, because I think you learn so much of what the challenges in that organisation are from the people doing it and the customers they're interacting with or the service users they're interacting with, way more than you learn from a board pack sitting on a board or at the top of the organisation, because sometimes there's things that you just don't realise, and I find sometimes when I feed them back to senior leaders, they're really shocked by the inefficiencies and the issues that people in the organisation have that they don't realise. And I find the bigger the organisation, the more detached senior leaders can be from the kind of the cogs.
Right.
Just thinking about having this feedback then, making changes and implementing feedback is great, but it's quite reactive rather than being proactive and ahead of the game. You're almost fixing things that are not right. How do you move yourself into a different state, which is fixing things and implementing things before they're needed?
Yeah, I like to think about this as a question that I always like to ask businesses, kind of cheek and tongue, because I know the answer, but it's does your business have a GPS that's guiding your business to where you want to go? And a lot of times they'll say, well, no, like what does that even mean? And if you could just do this thought experiment, if you were able to open up your phone, go to Google Maps, and as sophisticated as that application is, what would happen if we did not put in a clear destination? You know, it's one thing to say, my destination is the United Kingdom. That could mean a lot of different things, millions of different things. It's very different if you plug in a specific address in central London, right? And so I think plugging in the destination ultimately is going to be what helps us optimize the route to get there and understanding what are priorities to getting there and what is not. And so where I always start with the business before we get into tactics, before we get into strategy, before we get into any type of performance improvement, we just start at a high level. Does everybody know where we want to go, by when, and what needs to happen to get there? And so think about this. You sit on a couple boards. How many organizations do you come across that if you were able to walk into the board or even to the leadership team, could everybody answer these questions in all the same way? What's our short-term vision over the next 2 years? If the next 2 years was going to be wildly successful for the business, how do we quantify that? And what are the metrics that would tell us we've been successful? From there, to be on track to achieve that 2-year vision, what's our next 12-month mission? What do we need to achieve and where do we need to be over the next 12 months to be on track for that 2-year vision? Next, what's most important over the next 6 months that, if achieved and if delivered on, would put us on track to achieve our 12-month mission, and then back it down even further. As a result of where we need to be over the next 6 months, what are the top 2 or 3 priorities in the current quarter that must be focused on more than anything else? Very few, I've yet to come across an organization where at least even their leadership team can plug in those fill in the blanks in all the same way. And so back to your question, how do you know what to focus on? How do you know what to take action on? How do you know what to prioritize? Well, if that destination's not clear and the milestones along the way are vague and abstract and unclear, that opens up the big, broad question that you asked is, how do I know what to focus on and prioritize? And the answer is, you're never going to know. It's probably going to be what the most exciting, shiny object is that's sitting in front of you that may or may not have revenue potential attached to it. But going through that business GPS exercise, if you can get everybody clear on what's most important over the next 3 months, 6 months, 12 months that keeps us on track to hitting that 2-year vision. Now you at least have a priority scope to understand what to say yes to and what to say no to. And so that clarity breeds focus and focus drives execution. But it only starts with having that destination. It would be like plugging a country into that destination box in Google Maps. That could land you in a million different places, which then could have a subset of 2 million different priorities. So without a clear destination, it's virtually impossible to develop clear priorities.
What about if you're in a very fast moving market and you don't know where you're going to be in 2 years' time? Because things are changing so quickly, the funding landscape, the political landscape, etc., are changing so quick. And I can think of some instances, certainly for some industries recently, with political changes that have happened. What happens if you can't see where you're going to be in 2 years' time? So then, how do you get back to the 1 year, 6 month thing? Because actually, that 2 year thing is, I'm just going to Europe at this point instead of the United Kingdom. So how do you then pare that back, like you say?
Yeah, I think not doing the work of understanding where you want to be, even if it's stretchy, even if it's aspirational, it makes everything harder with then being able to generate the short-term activities. And so one of the things that I love about a quote Jeff Bezos said and really helped guiding Amazon over the past 2 decades was, you can be flexible on the tactics, right? The path you take, the journey you take, you can be flexible, you can pivot, you can adapt, but you've got to stay stubborn on the destination. Because if the destination's always changing, and so if that 2-year vision is unclear or not there, then I would challenge an organization of saying you need to be prepared for literally everything getting harder. And that could mean over the next 3, 6, 9 months, you may be prioritizing things that in no way, shape, or form get you to where you ultimately want to be. And so even if it's a bit higher level, even if there's noise in the short term, it at least allows you to develop a strategic arithmetic saying, this is the macro environment. This is my destination. I now have a couple of guardrails to develop strategy within. Right? But if you don't have that other guardrail of where you want to go, then you're at the mercy of completely and purely reacting to macro chaos at the moment, which could actually pull you further away from the place you want to be because you're trying to optimize for the short term. And I think there is optimization that can happen in the short term. But if it's not anchored to helping you get to where you want to go by factoring in the macro environment, it's the term mission drift, I think perfectly applies here because you're such in a reactive state, the risk profile that you're now taking on for your mission to drift to something else becomes an overwhelming probability.
Absolutely agree. Absolutely agree. And I've been in that situation myself. Absolutely. What about limiting beliefs then for leaders? We're thinking about this 2 year plan. What happens if the leader has this limiting belief, this limiting self-belief, I guess, that actually, and they set the bar a bit too low for that 2 year plan, which is really easy to do as a leader. I've done it myself. You can't dream big. You can't see where it's going to come from, so you can't do it. So that just means to me, you can't do it. And so you should set the bar lower. What would you say to someone like that in the mindset I've been in the past?
Yeah, I think 2 big things come up for me there is one, use the 50% rule. And so when I'm working with organizations and we're setting that 2-year vision, look, we're human, right? But where I help organizations is say, this is not meant to be a short putt. We don't want this to be a high probability encounter. And so we use the rule of 50%. And I go around the room and I poke and prod and challenge to get that 2-year vision to a place where on average, everyone in the room feels at around 50% confident we would be able to achieve it. And I've always found that being a pretty good place to identify it's stretchy, it's aspirational, but falls just short of being impossible, right? And so if everybody sets that vision and everybody roughly feels that as we sit here today, there's a 50-50 shot, whether we think we can achieve it or not, that's what I kind of like to strive for. And for the fear on, that 50% of thinking, well, we may not be able to achieve it, to that, I would say, good. Let's get that in the middle of the table and let's play with it. Let's almost take ourselves in a position 2 years from now. And this vision was a terrible disaster. We couldn't have failed bigger while trying to achieve this vision. I challenge the teams to play with that. And instead of it being a postmortem exercise where you look after the fact around what worked and what didn't work, we go through a pre-mortem exercise by assuming failure and then reverse engineering what are all the things that we can come up with that would lead to this vision becoming a disaster or a failure. And we don't hide from it. We put all those things on a whiteboard. We make a list. Let's make sure that these are all the biggest, highest risk things that could get in the way of us achieving this vision. And now we're able to incorporate elements within our strategy and our vision and our mission and the milestones to account for those things not happening. And so I love when that fear comes out because that's exactly something that we should play with. Let's bring me your worst fears and let's get them on the middle of the table. Let's find out how much fact or fiction is in those fears. And usually when you start taking them one by one and breaking them down, and then we start rating how likely is this to happen? If these are all the things that could show up in that 50% low confidence that we won't be able to achieve it, let's really break it down. What would be the catalyst of these things happening? And what are the controllables for us? What can we do to, if not completely eliminate the probability of these things happening, but proactively minimize the risk of these things happening? And so I think it's running towards that fear, not ignoring it or avoiding it.
I absolutely like it. I don't disagree with anything you've said. I think the one thing that's just coming up in my mind is, so you set a stretchy target for your 2 years and you don't meet it because, it was 50-50 whether you were going to meet it. It was stretchy. How do you deal with that internal communication piece to your team? Because you'll have communicated this target to them. The whole business will be working towards it. If you don't meet that, is that then a demotivator for the wider team? And how do you manage that communication piece and keep people motivated?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's where it could. I think that's where the tracking and the measuring element really comes in, right? We want to make it quantifiable. We want to have it out there for us to achieve. But I think a leader's job is to make sure everyone understands reality and then also instills hope, right? That was one of the best leadership quotes that comes from Ken Chenault, the former chairman and CEO of American Express, when he asked about how he would define leadership. And I loved it. Like, just be real with the team. Don't set a stretchy target and say, this is a must hit. And if we come up 1% less than this, it's a failure. Instead, be real with the team saying, look, this is aspirational. This is stretchy. This is going to force us to be better than we've ever had to be before. It's going to force us to scale, force us to evolve and adapt. And we're only putting about a 50% confidence rating on this right now. How you track and score is really what you want to do is get to about 70 to 75% and have all of your tracking and measuring to be that's green. That's almost a win. If we can get to 70% of this or higher, that's what we're shooting for. 49 to 69% is kind of that at risk. That's where we're that's what's going to show up as yellow on all of your tracking and measuring. And then if we're not within 40% of the goal, that's red where we got to take action on it. So I think it really is setting reality and expectations for the team. This is not meant to be one of those, the vision that we're going to hit and hit 100%. We need a lot of things to go well for us to do that. That's what we're striving for. But you want to set that target to be around 70%. And it's kind of like the old saying goes, right? Even if you shoot for the moon and miss, you still land in the stars. And 70% needs to be such a transformational progress leap forward that even if you hit 70 or even 60%, people can look back and say, wow, look at what we've done. Look at the progress we're making. And as you go into re-implement this cycle for the next 2 years, even if you show up at 65, 70, 75% of that 2 year vision, you still have a hell of a lot of momentum and a tailwind at your back to really go out there and do the same thing again, to now stretch the organization even forward, because the culture that needs to be built is one of continuous improvement. Is we're trying to get 1% better every single day. We're always going to look to see how we can be better, how we can add more value, and ask the question, what more are we capable of? So you want to build a culture that's always striving to continuously improve, not just reach a finite finish line and says, we're done, we made it.
Yeah, 100% agree with you. So many people don't have this vision of continuous improvement. They're just, okay, project's done. For this, for me, you continually want to be pushing the boundaries in any business or organization or part of your life to achieve more and more and more. And I think there's a balancing act between that, isn't there? Where one, that is fantastic and the right thing to do. But two, it could be very, very exhausting and you could reach burnout because you're constantly pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing. And I'm not saying you shouldn't push, but I think sometimes you could be pushing 5% or 200% all the time. So I think sometimes you can see burnout, and I've certainly experienced that of pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing before. And, I haven't changed my mindset. I still believe you need to push, but I've seen the darker side of what it can cause in a leader as well. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, lots of thoughts on that. I think that comes down to a leadership issue, right? Is burnout typically shows up when you're being pushed without context or a why behind why it is we're pursuing this, instead of just being command and control. This is what we are pursuing. But when you have all the elements in place of clarity, this is why our vision is our vision. This is why we're pushing to get to this level. This is why it's important for the business, for our customers, and how we're going to be a top player in the industry. Whatever that why is, I think needs to be communicated clearly over and over and over. Does your team feel like they have the why behind what we're pushing to do? Because then it's going to allow them to be more self-motivated, to feel like they're part of something bigger, a bigger mission that goes beyond just them. Once you have clarity, continue to add the context around what winning and success looks like, how your division plays a role in helping get us here, how this particular role, function, area of the business can help support this mission and our big why behind doing what we're doing. And then accountability. Once tracking and measuring is in place, here's where I've never seen burnout show up, is when teams continue to show up and improve and do things they otherwise didn't think was possible. In most cases, that's energizing, not draining. What's draining is when you're pushing a team to do what seems impossible and nobody knows why in the hell we're doing this, right? And so I think it comes down to the leadership to set clarity, to generate the context, to have the accountability mechanisms in place. And if you have an organization that's continuing to strive and perform better and better and better and reach new targets, look, at the end of the day, we're humans. So I think it really all comes down to leadership. And if people are being pushed for the right reason, that they subscribe into, that they feel part of the mission and can clearly see the progress being generated from that push, I think that's more fuel than it is drain.
Absolutely, really inspiring answer. What do you think's the biggest barrier people have to scaling in your experience? What do you think is the thing that holds people back the most? Is it mindset?
Yeah, I think it comes down to, it really starts with an organizational mindset, right? And so think about how a mindset could play in the scenario we just determined. What happens if that continuous improvement mindset and culture is not there? If it's a culture of status quo and just wanting to maintain, there could be a lot of friction of then trying to implement something like this when the mindset is not there. And so I kind of think for an organization, mindset is just the manifestation of how people show up as the output that is the culture, right? And for a leader to develop the culture that you want, it ultimately comes down to three big things. The culture that then drives an organization's mindset comes down to three big areas: what you tolerate, what you don't, and are leaders setting, from a behavioral standpoint, the benchmark of what the culture should look like. Those three things matter more than anything else when setting culture and mindset for an organization. And then from there, it's really 5 steps. And these are the 5 steps that, when I see organizations become effective in these areas, they always scale and scale successfully. When one or all of these areas are weak for an organization, scaling becomes virtually impossible, or they're going to grow their way into failure. And it always starts with priority management, or in some cases, avoiding priority mismanagement. Does the organization know what the 2-year vision is, and how do our short-term priorities align with where we're going over the next 6, 12, 24 months? And so, are the priorities clear? Are they, are they provided with the right context around why the priorities are the priorities? Because once that's in place, it goes to the next phase, which is focus. So priorities unclear will always create scattered focus. When priorities are clear, that's what allows leaders to harness the focus of an organization to put the right energy, effort, and resources behind the things that matter most. Then it comes down into communication, right? So prioritization and focus can only happen with effective communication. And it can't be just one and done. You can't just stand up there behind a podium at an annual kickoff or a town hall meeting. Are we continuously communicating what the priorities are and where should we be focused? That takes us to the 4th stage. When those 3 things are in place, it will always improve execution. Prioritization, communication, focus, then execution, and last but certainly not least, accountability, right? These become the 5 stages that, if you do these things really well, success is an overwhelming probability. When these things are not done well, it will always get in the way of a company successfully scaling. And so when you look at all of the failures, one of these 5, if not all 5, show up as a weakness, versus when you look at companies that have scaled successfully, you see effectiveness in all 5 of these areas. So that's where I think systems that can help companies be consistently effective in those 5 areas are the single greatest launch pad to scaling an organization successful.
It's been amazing. I think that's probably a really good place for us to end. So thank you so much for your time today. If listeners want to reach out to you or get in touch with you, where should they head to?
Yeah, 2 places to kind of find out more about how I help businesses with the systems that makes these different areas effective. Go check out my website, and that's just performancemindsetcoaching.co. That's where you'll learn a little bit about my background, the systems, the operating system I use. And then if you want to connect, which I would love to connect, just feel free to go to my LinkedIn, Aaron Trahan on LinkedIn. And I'm always trying to add value to the community there and add, bits of advice and learning lessons that I acquire along the way that helps make your journey to scaling a business easier than my journey was.
Thank you so much for the time. It's been absolutely insightful. So thanks so much.
Appreciate it, Richard.
That's it for this episode of Scaling Up, Not Giving Up. Big thanks to Aaron for sharing so openly, especially around what it really takes to lead through fast growth without losing your grit. If this episode gave you something to think about, the 50% rule, feedback that actually helps, or that idea of scaling yourself first, share it with someone else building something. You can connect with Aaron at performancemindsetcoaching.co or on LinkedIn. And if you're enjoying the podcast, hit follow and leave a review wherever you're listening. It helps more than you think. For all episodes plus more resources and writing, head to richard-lee.co.uk. See you next time.